So, welcome to Reflecting Backwards, Navigating the PhD by Prior Publication in Creative Practice Research. This is the fourth in a series of webinars that I've been doing under the auspices of the Mexico Practice Network and supported by my own role at Southampton Solent University, where we've been trying to address some of the issues and questions that early career researchers might have around this concept of creative practice research. So there's been a few so far. We've looked at defining things like outputs, outcomes and impact. We've looked at just kind of trying to define creative practice research, and we've done a little bit about writing those pesky rep statements. So, and today I have with me today Nick Cope, who is currently employed in Vietnam, and he's going to tell you all about himself. And we are going to look at this idea of a PhD by prior publication by practice. And this is something that I've been trying to explore at my own university, where we have a number of practitioners who have a body of work, and they're being encouraged to publish, to do the PhD by prior publication, by practice, and trying to work out some of the answers to these questions that we're going to explore today. And I thought, well, who better to answer those questions as Nick? So, Nick, could you just introduce yourself to the people who are watching?
Yes, well, it's night time here. It's about 11:30 p.m. in Vietnam, and I've got a stinking cold. So I might waver a little bit during the conversations. But yeah, very happy to be here and to join. I've been here in Vietnam for 5 years. This is my sixth year working for RMIT Vietnam. So the Australian University, RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, has had a campus here for over 20 years. And 5 years ago, I came here to set up a brand new degree program in digital film and video production, and have been here ever since, and have had insights into some contemporary Australian practice research matters, which I'll again we can talk about and touch on later. How did I get here? Reflecting backwards, prior to coming to Vietnam, I was working in Suzhou, China, for Xi'an Jiaotong-Liverpool University, where I was head of school of English communication, English culture and communication, and running digital media courses within a communication studies program, and also setting up a film school there. And that all kind of came off the back of, in many ways, completing my PhD. I was at the University of Sunderland for 10 years before leaving the UK. And I mean, the meat of a lot of our discussions today begin when I began at Sunderland, which was around 2004. As the discussions that came before MEXA, the AMPI, Association of Media Practice and Education, I think it was called the AMPI section of MEXA or something.
Well,
There was a kind
it
of
became
pre
the practice network. So the practice
yes.
network is the standard bearer holder of AMPI.
And I joined University of Sunderland as a lecturer, a senior lecturer in media production, video and new media production in 2004. After 3 years at University of Hull, which was my first lecturing post, after I completed my master's, when I was a technician instructor at Southampton Institute, East Park Terrace, where I spent a happy 6 years and took a master's under the great Fred Vermerel at the time, and was looking into kind of actually web design and incorporating video into the early days of the what seems now like the early days of internet. But I was 16mm and film video technician instructor in a fledgling media production department, where I kind of began in academia. But yeah, moved on. When I got my master's, I moved into lecturing and got a position with the University of Hull for 3 years, setting up departments in digital media and digital arts, and then moved up to the University of Sunderland, as I said, in 2004. And at that time, the department, which was a media production department, was very much engaged in these AMPI discussions about what might constitute a practice-based PhD. Um, and some of those discussions also happened when I was working at the University of Hull. I was in a kind of very, very creative, again, a school. What was the school called? It consisted of fine art, performance, theatre studies, dance, and creative music technology. And I set up a couple of programs in digital media, digital arts. So it was a really interesting creative environment there. And the discussions were also just kicking off at that time between 2001, 2004 within performance, I think it was Parrot, Practice as Research in Performance. There was a whole organization sort of looking at what might constitute within academia, with those sectors of academia, practice-based research. So my entire kind of lecturing career, from sort of when I first took up a lecturing post 2001 and then moved to Sunderland in 2004, was concurrent with discussions and debates about what can constitute practice-based research in the media practice environments and creative practice environments. Yeah, I found myself immersed professionally in those discussions, and then personally. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to stop
Let's
there
yeah,
as
well,
an
let's come on to
introduction.
that. So,
Yeah.
why what what drew you to pursue a PhD by prior publication rather than just do a PhD by practice? Do you want to kind of introduce that?
Yeah, I mean, very good. I mean, I spent about 6 years prevaricating around that very question and attending AV PhD seminars and some of these symposia, a really good symposia where representatives of a whole host of British media universities, I think it was coordinated through Westminster. Um, Coordinated through Westminster, and they hosted at different universities a series of symposia, and very eminent and engaged academics in the media practice arena were attending all of these. And I felt like I was a younger, early career researcher at that time. Um, I still think of myself as relatively early career in terms of research, but I think all as practitioners feel a little bit like that. And I was very interested in following the debates and the discussions that traced the history back to developments at the Royal College of Art in the 1990s. That then, helped inform some of the discussions that were then going on within media production in the early 2000s. Um, why did I take a practice-based route? I mean, I was attending professionally. I was going to a lot of symposia with colleagues and representing the University of Sunderland and listening as the University of Sunderland into the discussions that were going on through the AV PhD seminars and network, which I was just thinking earlier. I did have links in my PhD to their archive, which was hosted by University of Westminster. I don't know if it's still live, but there were the archive of the events what was online at one point, but well, I'll look into that again. Um, uh, I was weighing up two options. What could I do as a PhD? Why? Well, the first question: why did I think? Why would I do a PhD? I felt actually I felt a bit coerced into it because media lecturing, more and more universities were making the turn to insisting that media practice academics should have a PhD. I'd been lecturing by that time, probably 5 or 10 years as this sort of change was coming in. I believe Bournemouth was one of the first to insist that all new lecturers that they would appoint would have to have a PhD. So there was this move probably around 2007, 2008, where it was becoming apparent that rather than a mixture of ex-television and film professionals who'd moved into lecturing in media practice with their based on their professional experience, and definitely didn't have PhDs. And people like myself, I'd come through probably a creative arts activities and kind of creative media industries activities into education as a technician, and didn't have a PhD. But yeah, the whole sector had moved to was moving to wanting
So you were
media.
kind, did you feel a bit pressured to kind of move in that direction?
Yeah, and I also felt if I was to move on anywhere, I was thinking,
Yeah.
would I move on from Sunderland at any point? And if I was to move on, would I have to have this PhD in the bag and in the back pocket?
But you could have registered for a PhD by practice and done that, but you chose to do a PhD by prior publication. Why did you make that choice?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Like, I'd been looking at a different project altogether that would have been probably a full time, and probably would have been I realized would have been a 5 to 6 year venture working with footage and films I'm still currently working with that were not my previous practice. And I realized that after prevaricating for 5 or 6 years and following the developments of the sector, that actually, if I wanted to get this PhD done more quickly, then going by the previous published route was a quicker route. It was a probably 18 months to 3 year route rather than a 5 or 6 year trying to do something whilst you're working full time and doing either a more traditional or a practice-based full PhD. The
But
I would
you had a body of practice, and I think that's the
exactly.
challenge. Is if you don't have that, you
Yeah,
kind of
then
there
you
isn't
are
really the
looking at
value,
a
is there?
practice, yeah, at engaging in a practice and contextualizing a practice, which is where we talk a little bit later. The RMIT model is quite interesting for contemporary practitioners.
Let's hold that thought and come back to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
because I wanted to just
For
just
me, it was a partly very pragmatic
yeah,
choices.
yeah.
Time's running out. What are the options? But also a colleague of mine at the University of Sunderland, Professor Julia Knight, who's written quite extensively on independent distribution and video art, diverse practices, one of her key texts. Um, when she joined the university, we got talking, and I happened to mention when she was talking about how she was currently then working on her book about the independent distribution scene in the 1980s, which you'll remember well, Roy, Albany Video and
Yeah.
Circles Women's Project, and the kind of fledgling and independent distribution networks were her area of research at that point. And I said, "Oh, I'd been involved in Scratch Video," um, and she pulled off of her shelf in the office the program. I've probably got a picture of it here. Anyway, she pulled the program of screenings, a touring program at the ICA. That Yeah, there we go. She pulled this off the shelf. Subverting Television, Deconstruct Scratch, uh, and Alter Image. And I'd never seen this program. And she got several copies and have one. And it was from the 1980s, and it was a program. It was three programs of work. Amidst one of my works was in the deconstruction, one of those programs. And I said, wow, that's amazing because I didn't have that. And I think one of the questions to talk about later is documenting work. And here was a very valid document from Film Video Umbrella touring program from 1980. Ooh, about 1984, 1985. No, yeah, my work had been in this program, but I'd never had a program. I never had a this printout. And it was really Julia instigated me in realizing that what were dusty old cassettes on my shelf were actually part of British video art history,
Right.
and that my experience and my engagement was a valid voice to contribute to a scene that was relatively little written about. And that was her word. So it was Julia who encouraged me to think about uh, reflecting backwards, as
Right.
the title of this event is, and realizing that, yeah, as we get older, we our work and our voice becomes a contributing factor to media histories. And yeah, that was very pivotal
Mm. I,
in my thinking about, oh right, well yes, there's yeah, Julia's very well positioned in this world, writing widely on independent video and independent distribution, and she's saying that that's something I should do. And I kind of thought, yes, I sort of picked up the baton. And I'd also seen some Wikipedia histories that kept sort of rewriting and rewriting histories, and my own name popped in and popped out. And I realized these kind of digital histories are not, they're not fixed anyway. So yeah, maybe Julia's right. Putting down your own account, your own history, is a way, and contributing your own voice is a way to helping consolidate
yeah,
the
yeah,
history. Uh,
absolutely. So look, let's move on a bit and talk about the challenges in validation and benchmark quality, because this is kind of really getting into the sort of nitty gritty and the difficult bits, isn't it? Really. So
yes,
the benchmark quality in academia is often, we talk about peer review, and if anyone who's published in journals understands that process. But how do you navigate something like a PhD by prior publication by practice, and how do you, because obviously that idea of peer review can't apply because the thing is gone, it's done, it's been done. So could you talk a bit about how you navigated that quality threshold, perhaps?
yeah, yeah. Uh, it was a little less rigorous than I'm certainly finding through RMIT now. What's required of me now, if I want to register current practice or previous practice through the university's research website and committees, there's a very rigorous process where all kinds of evidence and documentation needs to be submitted for further peer review. Before current work can then go up on contemporary university websites. Uh, Looking back to my time, I was writing in 2010 to 2012, and I spent a little while reading before that as well. I think I kind of say my PhD took about 3 years. It was I spent a year reading. I felt like there was things I wanted to be more conversant with. Actually, a lot of video art histories, getting up to speed with a lot of and contextual stuff. Um, and the University of Sunderland had a very interesting model for by previous publication, which was a 10,000 word commentary that could be written in 12 to 18 months about existing work. If the existing work past the threshold. And I guess the threshold was the initial entry interview with my supervisor, and then Julia was my internal examiner. So there was a meeting within Sunderland with an internal examiner and a supervisor to evaluate the project proposal. I think for me, because I was grounding my PhD in the Scratch video screenings, which had happened at the ICA in 1983, and then the film and video umbrella touring program in 1984. Those themselves, I think, counted. That I had evidence and documentation following Julia giving me the program. But there's evidence and documentation of curated, I guess, yeah, with being the ICA and film video umbrella,
Yeah,
recognized
yeah,
uh, bodies. Um,
Would that pass muster with the RMIT now, do you think?
I think so, but I actually had a challenge. I took a break from academia between 2016 and 2019. I was doing research work and other some other projects, and also caring for my mother. Um, and then I joined RMIT in 2019, 2020, and I'd been involved in the UK with again connected with Scratch Video, a fantastic opening night for the London Film Festival in 2019, curated by Stephen Malinder from Cabaret Voltaire, who I also worked with in the 1990s, and also that work was part of my reflections in the PhD. And he was curating a night about Scratch Video, and he wanted me to include my Scratch Video work with a younger VJ they've been working with. So we were sort of mashing analog and digital up into, and they were screening to live music plus a curated selection of screenings during the evening at the ICA. Yeah, probably, what would that be, 25, 35 years after the 1983 screenings. I kind of put that down on a website submission to RMIT Melbourne, saying, yeah, part of my kind of research practice, and they got back to me. They said, oh, I needed to submit evidence of email correspondence and gather program notes and all kinds of stuff, which I did over several months, and finally it did get acknowledged and accepted and can formally appear on my RMIT research resume. But that process of, yeah, I mean, it sort of made me even more aware for current practices to be curating thoroughly. Uh, all aspects of any peer review, any whether that's academic or whether it's through sort of gallery screenings, selections and invitations to work. Yeah.
I've heard other people say this is that, when you're doing the work, you need to be documenting and documenting and documenting and just sort of piling that stuff up because you don't want to be in a situation where you're having to go back and find that material. So
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And again, yeah, I don't. I was just going to say my work consisted of there's some DVDs, legacy media, but 3 decades of work, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, and luckily by the 2000s. I was having work screened at electroacoustic music and sonic arts events. I've actually got sort of several pages at the back of the CV where I had kept documentation in the 2000s more thoroughly than maybe in previous decades. So I'd got sort of symposia and publications and conferences, as well as actually newspaper stories and all sorts of stuff where work had been covered. So yeah. Especially in the contemporary framework. Yeah, I fully concur.
keep
Yeah,
a scrapbook. So
yeah.
were there moments where you felt during that process of your PhD that you felt that some elements were undervalued within the academic framework, and how did you address that?
Um, I didn't really. I had a very supportive and relatively hands-off progress through the whole process at Sunderland. I mean, I've been working there for quite a while. The model of practice-based research already existed. My supervisor was Professor John Story, a cultural studies academic professor, who I knew personally as a colleague, and then as a supervisor. And um, he took a relatively hands-off approach. I think actually most of it was all about the initial green light meeting. I forget what they call it at Sunderland. We have a similar process now at RMIT Melbourne where there's sort of the initial kind of entry uh, proposals, and if it's considered, it was certainly at Sunderland, if it was considered rigor enough, it was then given a green light. And my proposal was to contextualize my own contemporary practice, because even at that point, I'd been collaborating for nearly 10 years with an electroacoustic composer on some visual music compositions, visual music short films. Um, and connecting contemporary practice with the context of my scratch video work. So I was writing about the historic context
Hmm.
as well. Um, so I was getting a green light from both Julia became the internal examiner and the supervisor. So I was getting some kind of, I think they were satisfied that the due rigor was there in the work and the originality and the, if you like, the contribution to new knowledge,
Yeah.
which essentially is at the heart of any PhD work. So they were satisfied that the work I was putting forward was um, original and had a contribution in knowledge. And it was for me to then write the contexts for that as the practice by previous publication framework.
So let's talk a little bit about retrospective documentation and theorization. So I have a question here about when you are looking back at material, is there a challenge around imposing meaning on things that perhaps wasn't there at the time? And is that something that you experienced? And if so, how did you sort of manage that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Uh, for me, it wasn't a case of looking to impose meaning, but I think that's something that maybe early career researchers or practitioners who, and I've worked a lot with media practice educators who come from a filmmaking or media practice background, and then they find themselves in the academy teaching, and there's a kind of a chip on our collective shoulders. We think, oh, I'm not a real academic. Those professors of cultural studies and those people writing books and chapters are the real academics, and I'm not a real academic. And then, oh, I have to kind of find some narrative about my work that sounds academic, or Sunderland, the real the opening 6 months of the PhD, they had very good graduate research service that supported PhD PhD students. And they always said the question was, "What's your research question? What's your research question? And what are your uh, methodologies?" They were very generic workshops, so they thought that which I think in the humanities it can be harder to find what are your methodologies and what are your research questions, and um, that notion of sort of finding the methodology to understand your work felt like a bit of a weight. But I kind of I at least have a lot of talks with my collaborator who became Professor of Contemporary Music at the University of Kent, Professor Tim Howell, who's now retired. But we used to actually sit on long car journeys to conferences to show work, and sort of scratch our collectives' heads, because we would say, well, our collaboration had just come about. It was very well, as I kind of later found, very kind of more improvisational, intuitive, tacit, collaborative, creative practice. We didn't sit down and discuss theories. We just made stuff,
Mhm.
and then it submitted it for conferences. It got accepted, and there was like a momentum and trajectory for the work, and also a small audience, but a niche audience within sonic arts events and in computer music events. That gave us a research track record of work being peer reviewed, selected, shown, shared, and published on DVD.
Mhm.
And yeah, we just sort of scratch our heads and say, well, how do you talk about that? How do we talk about this creative process where it's not derived from a explicit research question? It is a creative practice that we don't fully understand, but results in outcomes. And I kind of started to articulate a notion inspired by the late great Tony Wilson of Factory Records, who had a definition of praxis, whereby praxis is where you find out what you've done after you've done it. You do stuff and you find out afterwards what it is you've done and why you've been doing it. And I had a definition. So I had Tony Wilson's definition one time, which I think had in a present. A conference presentation at one point, but I guess it's probably also derived, knowing Tony Wilson being a well-read man, and probably derived from Marxist notions of praxis. But I started doing so. I did a few papers sort of based around the notion of praxis as research and this sort of notion of engaging in work and reflecting afterwards and being a valid process. Um, and that tacit knowledge, improvisation, uh, collaborative practices, and reflecting on them become the research contexts.
Mm.
And I got a couple of great quotes that I came across during my readings whilst writing the PhD from Des Bell, who's been published now, and it was during COVID, wasn't it? You were involved in the conference where Des Bell was one of the keynote
Yeah,
videos. Mentioned
he
that.
wrote, I think, the introduction to the special issue from that conference. Yeah,
Right, right. And he'd recently published a whole book, hadn't he, on his
yeah,
book on
yes,
practice-based
yeah, yeah.
research.
It's
He'd been
good.
writing in the Journal of Media Practice back in the early 2000s. And in fact, I will quote it. I took it. I will quote it because it goes at the head of my preface. Because Des Bell wrote that there is little doubt that the artist researcher, if they commit themselves to the task of documentation and critical contextualization and reflection on their work, can, in collaboration with like-minded others, produce an intersubjective framework for understanding the work they produce. Indeed, we might want to give the name research to this hermeneutical activity of arriving at communicable knowledge of art practice. And actually, Des Bell's work, that paper and actually that quote were one of the keys that helped unlock for me how to think about the context of my work and how to articulate the context of my work. And he also went on in the same paper to quote uh, um, David Davis from a book called Art as Performance. And again, this was the other sort of turn of the key that really helped me understand how I could approach my practice over 3 decades as well, not just the current work, because David Davis talked about he articulated a notion of addressing art as performance and saying that the performative context of creating a piece of art, whether it's a painting or any creative practice, the performance of creating it and the contexts for creating it, whether they are socio-political, cultural, material, whatever they are the research contexts of can be considered the research context for a creative practice. I got the quote in front of me. To properly understand the manifest work, we must treat it not as an objectified sign structure, but as an embodied and historically situated performance. And this made me sort of realize that the contexts that had led to my own work arising were relevant contexts to think about whilst contextualizing and writing the work. Which for the Scratch video work made me think about or made me write about post-punk DIY cultures, the emerging independent music and video distribution scenes, early independent practices by Factory Records, Industrial Records, Double Vision, which is Cabaret Voltaire's video label, for publishing kind of post-punk video work. And there have been very little written about that. Things have been written about video art context, but not much about the DIY post-punk sort of context that all kinds of practices arose out of. And so, yeah, Des Bell's sort of articulations and his sort of focusing on David Davis' definitions of art as performance really helped me to sort of not actually impose meaning, but realize contexts, if you like, consider what the context for the creation of my own work was, and say, oh yeah, these things are important in understanding how and why my work came about, and locating, if you like, locating and articulating the work. Yeah.
Yeah, articulating is key here, isn't it? It's because it's how, and I think this, I struggle myself to figure out how to articulate what I do as research. Let's move on a bit and let's talk about um, how can creative practitioners balance the need for artistic freedom and the constraints of academic rigor? And this kind of comes out of this idea that you might be an artist, you might be practicing an artist, you might also be an academic. And you don't necessarily have to claim your
Yeah,
artistic
yeah, yeah,
practice it, but
yeah,
you can just do that at home.
yeah,
When you go home, nothing to do with it. But once you start to claim that and bring that in, you are suddenly then faced with this, oh, what, all this stuff about what is your research question and where are
yeah.
your outputs, what is the rigor? How do you kind of balance that as a creative, as a practitioner with that sort of academic rigor?
Yeah, yeah. For me, in fact I joined University of Hull in 2001. It was my first lecturing position, and I was involved in a live performance. We had a creative music technology department with um, uh, uh, what would I call them? Practicing composers, electronic music composers, practitioner composers as academics. Um, they did a performance in the local theatre in Scarborough, Sir Alan Ayckbourn's theatre in Scarborough, of student work, and invited me to kind of improvise a live visual mix to the work. And we had a great night and thoroughly enjoyable. And at the end, well, apparently Sir Alan didn't enjoy it. It wasn't the kind of thing that should be done in a theatre. But to be honest, it was a cinema as well. They did use it as a local cinema, so we did this rather kind of psychedelic and abstract and visual music event. But my colleague, who I later continued to work with, Tim Howell, um, saw one live mix of some work, and he said, "I want to compose a soundtrack to that." And he went ahead and composed a piece of work. Directly, I gave him the video work in particular. It's a piece we've got a piece of ours called Open Circuits, which has later been published on DVD by the Computer Music Journal. And yeah, having Tim composing is very easy for me as an already existing mix of work, and Tim to compose a brand new soundtrack. And then through collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, really, Tim started to submit that work and screen it at through the sort of Sonic Arts Network and the Computer Music Network, which in the early 2000s was just starting to embrace the whole notion of audiovisual work in computer-based composition. And our work became an exemplar and quite distinct to a lot of other work in that field, where there was a lot of generative computer visuals that were coming out of the collaboration of sound and image. But we were two individuals collaborating, and that work became quite distinct. And also found I went through peer review processes for screenings, for conferences, and for publication on DVD with the MIT published Computer Music Journal. So what I found is the work was finding its context, if you like, and they were academically rigorous. What I found interesting was music, collaborating across a different discipline. Music was far more established. A composer can, write composition and have an orchestra perform it, and everybody's happy. That's absolutely valid practice within the academy. In fact, that's what you should be doing. Composing work and having it performed. And co colleagues were having PhDs where they composed work and contextualized it, and that was they didn't even have to have practice-based research
Right.
discussions scratching
Well,
their heads
that's
about
what
what
they
they
do.
were doing. Yeah, which I found fascinating and have always found that the Music Academy is far more open and sort of acknowledging than the screen media knowledge sort of areas. So Tim got a professorship on the back of our collaboration, and I am still just a mere senior lecturer working away in the back end of yeah, media production with people asking me to justify and these very questions you're asking today, yeah, I found it very ironic when Tim 10 years ago was made professor at University of Kent and dropped me a line saying, and it's based on our collaborative work, which is very nice for me, something
Yeah,
I
yeah.
could contribute to. So that, yeah, it is really interesting to sort of, especially in an era where people are again paying great lip service to collaborative work and interdisciplinary work, but then how they actually measure it and want it measured and calculated becomes, yeah, we do run into these challenges. But for me, I mean, again, I kind of was able to. I don't know if I've got much here, but yeah, I was able to literally list screenings and peer review events. Let me just find, yeah. So open circuits, I was able to pull up a great list of various international and national conferences and sonic arts events and visual art events where the work was uh, being selected by peer review and screened. Uh, so again, it was a case of keeping a lot of that documentation as well. What I find now
Right.
is that's from 2003. That was made in 2003. RMIT Melbourne are not interested in any work over 5 years old.
Right.
So one's back catalogue almost doesn't count for anything either. So I don't know how widespread that is in contemporary research practices, but your last 5 years are the most critical or
I
whatever.
think
So
there's certainly it's so that there's a limit to how far you can go back. I think it
yeah,
around
yeah,
five years. So
yeah.
we're kind of at 45 minutes now. So I just want to sort of push into this idea, the Australian model that you talked about.
Yeah,
Do
yeah.
you want to kind of outline what that is and what it looks like?
Yes, I mean it's definitely a RMIT Melbourne model. They have been engaged in practice-based work in various ways for a number of years. And the first time I went to Melbourne, I was working in China in 2015, and a couple of they've both left RMIT now, but Craig Batty and Leo, I forget Leo's surname, the senior media practitioner at Melbourne, basically were key instigators of what's become Sightlines online journal for publishing filmmaking in the academy in Australia, which is similar to Screenworks here in the UK. And I contacted them and went in 2015 and joined their symposia and they called it symposia and festival because they were screening a lot of academic-based film practice and discussing what can constitute film practice in the academy. So I kind of sort of proposed to articulate some of my experiences since 2004 in the UK and thoroughly enjoyed engaging in that and also realized they were in many ways they felt like they jumped ahead of the UK. There were already existing PhDs with filmmakers making work and articulating it and various frameworks taking form and this journal that was taking shape. They're having discussions of how can we publish this and that Sightlines journal followed and now is in several volumes into its published life. Um, And Sightlines as a conference has continued, biannual conference in Australia for sharing and discussing practice-based research. So that was already underway by the time I joined RMIT Melbourne, RMIT Vietnam in 20 end of 2019, 2020. We hit the whole COVID mess, but as we come out of the COVID mess, the what they call a PRS, Practice Research Symposium, visited Vietnam, and they have a whole model called PRS that has arisen out of creative writing, architecture, design. For it's a actually a very scaffolded model for practice-based work that has 6 monthly meetings where the students, PhD students, present their work in progress, their practice in progress, and their kind of articulation of the context for the practice. But actually, for them, it's the practice itself and your articulating of the originality of the practice that is the body of work that has to pass these 6 monthly presentations and evaluations. So a whole team came over from Melbourne to Vietnam every 6 months now to run what's called PRS Asia, where we have a variety of PhDs underway, including various creative writers in Singapore, various architects here, and now colleagues of mine in the design school with projects. Well, they'll have a weekend where each student presents their work and they get feedback from their supervisors and a panel. And there's a kind of each of those are a kind of threshold, a sort of gatekeeping threshold for the progression of the candidate as well. But it's very much focused on uh, establishing a practice, articulating the practice, which I've a creative practice, which I found very interesting. Uh, and it's been going some time now. They also have PRS Europe because I think they have a campus in Barcelona and a lot of candidates in Melbourne.
Okay. Sounds like an interesting approach. I might have to look into that. So,
Mm.
looking back at your experience,
Mhm.
what would you do differently?
Actually, I had I've recently been through various training sessions for doing PhD supervision because I've actually never supervised all the time since I qualified. I've been busy setting up new departments, things like that. And one of the questions in the training where they ask you about your experience of being supervised and so forth. And actually, my PhD journey, I'm very happy to say was actually very smooth, and my supervisor had very hands off but very helpful. Uh, my supervisor said three things at the outset. He said, and I got my notebook. He said, "What you need to do is this," and I wrote down these three things. He said, "What is it you did? What are the contexts for what you did, and what's original about what you did?" And I wrote those down, and they became really the basis of what became my work, and also become the basis for how I think about postgraduate research. What is it you do? What are the contexts for what you do? What's original? What's the contribution to new knowledge? And that's because he was a very experienced PhD supervisor, I think, and with years of supervision, he could sort of distill advice down into uh, those key points. And then he said, get writing. And I prevaricated for a while. He said, just get writing, just get writing. Um, and it can be a very long and lonely journey, but actually it's I've my reflecting backwards, it's probably one of the most valuable things I've done. Richly Roy, the moment I collected this hard copy from a printing shop in the back streets of Sunderland in a very grey car park, that was my highlight was looking at this sort of hard copy final submission copy and going, yeah, I've done it, and this is the culmination of the work. And just alone getting into a car in a car park of a printer's workshop was probably the most satisfying moment of the whole process because that was the end. It's finished. It's done. But ever since, So glad I've done it. I got so much in being able to articulate what my practice is, and the process of working out how to articulate, if you like, through sitting down and doing it. Uh, it was richly rewarding, and yeah, I wouldn't do anything differently. Yeah.
Not even done it, started it earlier.
It may have been good to have made the decision sooner, and not spent sort of about 4 or 5 years wondering about concentrate on the work that I'm still actually doing at this
But
very moment.
actually, it feels like sometimes you could say, "Yeah, I could have done this earlier," but it happens at the right time. And those conversations with Julia seem to have been really crucial in cementing that happened at the time it happened.
Actually, I would never have thought about writing about and contextualizing my own experience of contributing to the Scratch video movement. It was something that had happened a long time ago, and the tapes were dusting on the shelf, and that was that. But actually, a lot of new work arose out of that. I've ended up writing a couple of book chapters about Scratch video, and there were several uh, programs of Scratch video work and other work that in more contemporary times, reviewing the impact of the work and also flagging up this a relevance, a contemporary relevance for it. And in fact, I had that work published online by Screenworks and another separate piece, two pieces of Scratch writing and
Mhm.
practice. On Screenworks and Sightlines, addressing Scratch video in more recent years, and a chapter for the Radical Film Network book on
It
independent
was
cinema.
very influential. I recall the period of time, and I was a student at the time, going, "Wow, this is really cool." And just being just the enabling at that time as well in terms of technology. So just before we go to questions, we'll see if we've got any questions. So if people have questions, do put them in the chat. Nick, what advice have you got for all these young career
Yeah,
researchers?
even more so in the contemporary academic milieu, which loves and relishes administration and bureaucracy to uh, the extents I've never known before. That whole notion that we've talked about documentation, yeah, keep documentation. Take pictures when you're at conferences and events and screenings. Keep programs and program notes. Um, uh, I was lucky. I mean, my 1990s work, there was very little. I had some had reviews from music press, things like that, that I could draw on for some of the work in the 90s, which actually I didn't have much to draw on. But later work, yeah, I've got program notes and all sorts of contextualization. So. Yes, that's absolutely key, and probably communication. I suppose being able to evidence the peer review ness, whether it's
Mm,
because what I'm finding, I work in a school of communication design now. There's a lot of designers and digital media practitioners where they're a little bit more open to media in terms of gallery exhibitions can be counted for academics as kind of practice research. But again, it's being able to evidence the peer review or the curational process so that others can then evaluate whether
right,
it's
yeah,
whether
yeah,
it
yeah.
counts. Yeah.
Well, that introduces the one of the later seminars. I still haven't booked this one yet, but we're going to do some work on peer review, and in particular, we're going to look at peer review for non-screen based media because it feels in a way that screen based media it's not a written artifact, but it's still an artifact. You can go on a website, you can review it. Whereas if you've just done an opera in the back of a pub,
Mm.
it's kind of like, well, how do you peer review
Yeah.
that?
And that was, in fact, that was a challenge. I mean, for me, it wasn't just an opera in the back of a pub. It was an event at the ICA in London that were for the opening night of the London Film Festival. People in Australia, I don't even know if they knew the ICA London or its relevance. I hope that they do. But I was required to provide that whole, if you like, paper chain of evidence of how had I been asked to be involved? What was the levels of curation? What even to try, I was trying having to find. I mean, I didn't have a program of events, but I was able to find stuff online. So actually, yeah, I found even doing my own work, there was a lot of there's a fantastic project, the Rewind project in Dundee for collecting and artist video from the 1970s and 80s, and they also have a great archive of clippings and reviews from all kinds of independent media and so forth. So it's a case of finding all of those, all that paperwork relevant to your own work.
Capture it as you go if you can.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But yes, digging back into the past is quite challenging. So Nick, I've got loads more questions actually, but I realise we've overrun a bit, and I do want to offer up some questions in to the people listening. If anyone has any questions, please raise a hand, put a question in chat. So, um, so I'm going to ask one last question then. What is the difference between what you did and archive research? Is there a difference? Is this archive research, or is there something else going on here?
It's again another good question, and I know you sent me the questions we were mulling over before. You were talking about the notion of kind of was it ethnography as autoethnography? I don't know much about ethnography, so I kind of never considered it autoethnography. Is it self archiving? Um, in some ways, there's an element to that, and I realize more and more that that is an important part of work. But personally the value the actual personal value that came out of the whole process for me was the notion of locating the contexts for your own practice and being able to articulate a bit better than I could before my own practice. Uh, and that was really rich personal journey to dive the process of doing a PhD took me into reading widely, engaging widely with the context of my practice, whether that's video art, whether it was DIY post-punk cultures, early independent distribution, visual music practices, and affective theory, affective notions of how film operates was also something that came to the fore through the process of me asking myself, what are the contexts for my work? Uh, so it wasn't really the archiving; it was more understanding or coming across other people who could articulate well. For me, a great book, and Andy Birtwistle wrote a great book called Cinesonica that came out about 6 months before I finished writing. And again, it was another of those keys. It just everything he wrote and the way he looked at both scratch video and affective music video and linked these two things together with a very fresh at that time fresh overview and also a critique of the critiques of Scratch that had happened in the 1980s. And he said they'd all missed the point and they were actually quite irrelevant. And that there was another way to look at it, look at uh, um, visual music composition and Scratch video in those contexts. And I was way into my journey at that point. So that's another thing for early career researchers who may be going through this is the process itself reveals things during that journey, and that's one of the, if you like, one of the richnesses of the doing it is sort of these things revealing themselves, these contexts, these articulations that become valuable to yourself in understanding what you do, or may become key to yourself. For me, yeah, it was Des Bell, David Davis's Artist Performance, Andy Birtwhistle's book, and Julia. But for anyone else's work, it'd be other things, but similar things that may unlock and address some of those questions. And that's what the process was about for me. Not the archiving. It's nice afterwards to have all of this stuff collected in one place. And I was chatting online with another old friend of mine who's not an academic but a filmmaker and very successful one. We were at Art Foundation course together, and I was just sharing some Super 8 films we'd done together and a bit of old stuff. And he said, "Oh, it's great you kept all of that." Well, in many ways I hadn't, but the process of doing this made me pull a lot of those things together again at a far later date. So, retrospectively, the archiving aspect of it has been helpful. But that, for me, that wasn't the heart of the work. The heart of the work was sort of feeling my way through what are the contexts for what I've been doing, and that became really interesting. A kind of what a world or a creative and sort of contextual environment to see yourself, to locate yourself within, and to be able, yeah, for that to help one articulate one's own practice.
So we
Can
have
I
one
ask a
question.
question? Oh, sorry.
We
Yeah.
have a question in the chat. Is the 5-year rule reasonable, or should all of our work throughout our professional lives, including any previous private sector or education, pre-education outputs, be considered to have made us the academics we are or trying to become?
Yeah, I mean, my PhD was about 3 decades of work, and distinctly addressing the progression and the common context that I only knew through doing this, or only made those connections or articulated those connections through doing the work. The 5-year rule seems to be about more the bureaucracies of contemporary academic life, and uh, I mean, somebody who's been writing for, books for years and years, they're not asked to discount that work, are they? Well, I think my view is it all counts, but uh, yeah, you lead me into my sort of challenges as the contemporary academic world, because I
These
don't think
things
it's reasonable. I
become,
think
they're kind of,
by
they
public.
almost feel arbitrary sometimes, don't they?
Yeah, yeah. I can see they're trying to see if you're still actively practicing and still actively engaged. I can understand that. Yeah.
Someone
Uh,
else had a question?
yes,
Um,
please go ahead.
Tana.
Hi. Sorry, my camera's not quite good, but if I'm okay to just ask you through my voice. I'm in the process of writing a PhD by publication, and my work was, yeah, I made, I'm writing about films that I made back in 2000. I mean, our university doesn't have the 5-year rule, so um, it's quite old work. And just what you were talking about, the sort of literature that you drew from, I mean, this is one of the things that I'm struggling with, because there was, at the time that I made some of this work, very little was written about the sorts of themes that I'm dealing with. There's a lot of very contemporary literature which has just come out right now, and just now in the last couple of years, which is more relevant. And I'm really struggling with balancing, because you're expected to talk about the academic context in which you created your work, but that context was more intuitive and
Yeah.
was not written about or explored as much as it is now. I wondered
Yeah.
if you had something to.
What I liked about the Des Bell's drawing on David Davis art's performance is that David Davis was articulating that the contexts for creative practice can be so much more than just academic contexts, uh, so that the social, cultural, creative, material context that the work was originally made in. So your work in the 2000s, the context it arose out of, and thinking and locating those contexts are part of the research picture of that work. I also find current writings, like I said, Andy Birtwistle was writing in 2010, 11, or it was published in 2010. My work was finally published in 2012. It came out during my writing, but it was brilliant work, and he could articulate things far better than I could. So to be able to draw on contemporary writers who are bringing a perspective to previous work, I think is really helpful and valuable and relevant. So as the practitioner yourself, you can you can locate your work in the contexts it arose from, and also connect your work to these contemporary perspectives that others are now bringing. And you also can have a view on that perspective. Is it helpful to you, or do you have another view or another voice to add to their voice? But yeah, I'm also finding I nobody had really written a lot of literature about cinema as an affect was just coming out really in the mid to 2010s. It's much more widely written about now. And I found that really helpful because I felt my work was more about it was non-narrative, it was abstract, sometimes it was rhythmic. And Andy Birtwistle articulated that in the nightclub environment, scratch had been shown in the 1990s rave visuals and other stuff and expanded cinema practices. Film is working physically, affectively on us, not just on the sort of literary and narrative ways that film studies had addressed film up to that point. So new contexts, I think, are really, really helpful, and connecting your work to those contexts, if they're helpful, is I find really valuable and really interesting. Yeah, I mean, the 5-year rule didn't apply to my PhD, and I don't think it applies to PhDs in RMIT Melbourne. It applies to, as an academic, evidencing your research practice, your current practice.
Mhm.
Just to specify a little bit about that.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
uh,
What is the work about?
is Philip, do you have a question?
Well, it was simply, do you have references for the Des Bell and David's work? Because it sounds like it might be the last part of a jigsaw puzzle that perhaps
Yeah,
it may
I,
well fall into place for
I
myself.
I do. I'll try. I'll copy that. I might be able to do it right now. I've got my. Let's
Well,
see if
I'm
I can
having
find
slight
references.
difficulty with Zoom at the moment, so I
All
can't
right.
actually see the chat. Hence, I've kind of switched myself
Oh,
on.
what I'll do is if Nick emails me the references, I'll add
Yeah.
them to
Yeah.
Video.
the video. So I'll
Yes.
put it in the text with the
Yeah.
video.
Basically, David Davis is a book called Art as Performance,
Right.
and Des Bell quotes from it. But Des Bell was writing in the Journal of what was the Journal of Media Practice, and I've got it in front of me right now. I've got my references in front of me. In 2006. Yeah. So I'll
Because
put
I
it.
found creative media and media practice and research, a pursuit of the obscure object of knowledge. That seems to be a Desmond Bell.
That's the one. That is the one. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. That
Yeah.
answers the question. And and
Yeah.
and the
And
one
I'm
question.
sure his book is worth dipping into as well, but I haven't
Good.
read it.
It's good.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I read
it's on
it.
my list.
And to answer the question, do you not think as a pure as an insider outsider point of view, your retrospective reflecting on your work, and of course you can draw on contemporary literature because
Yeah,
that's what we are now is and this work was done previously. That's
yeah,
one of the
yeah,
whole points of
yeah, absolutely. And new knowledge is brought, new perspectives are brought, and
exactly.
they're
We're
really
not all the same artists we were in the, I'm 10 years ago. We're all completely different.
yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
I'm going to pause now and say thank you very much, Nick. We could carry on. I mean, maybe that's what we should have marathon discussions on these things. I will get this uploaded very soon, and I will send an email out with the link to everyone, and I'll include the references in there as well. Nick, it's fantastic to chat with you. I think the last time we bumped into each other in a bar, underground bar in Southampton,
yeah.
and I missed you at the conference in
Greenwich.
Greenwich. Yeah, I missed all that.
Sound and image, which was great.
Yeah, it did look good. It just I had other stuff going on, and I think in the end I was just I'm going to leave now. So, but thank you everyone for being part of this and for listening in and for your questions. And I'm going to close the recording now. Thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you, Roy. And we can share my contact and links. My work's available online at www.nickcopefilm.com, including the PhD and a lot of other stuff. So
I'll make sure that's included in the text. So great.
Fantastic. Absolute pleasure.
Hang on. Don't leave meeting. That's the wrong button.
Thank you.
Stop recording.
Thank you.